And we're live. It is 5 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time, September 20th, Friday. It is a emu shirt day, which means it's very special. And guest is running a few minutes late, which is not a problem. And so I am going to monologue for a minute, which is what I do anyway at the top of the show. So look, folks, there's no rule that says that if you're a Nazi porn monger who does peeping toms with bathrooms and stuff, that you can't run for governor. There's no rule that said. There may be a rule that says it's going to be hard to get people to vote for you, but there's no rule that says you can't run. It's a free country. You're allowed to run. There is a rule, unwritten, maybe not quite comprehensible to some people, but I think important to emphasize. There is a rule that says if you're a Nazi pornmonger who brings pizzas into the back rooms at porn video stores on a nightly basis and who does peeping Tom stuff in bathrooms, that you can't run for governor without humiliation. And again, no rule that says you can't run, but to the extent that you're expecting to run and have everybody pay a lot of respect to you, you're probably not going to be able to do that. So I want to emphasize to you all, if you're thinking of running for governor of North Carolina or some comparably sized state, that there are certain things you may not be able to get away with and that may involve humiliation. Look, we are not allowed to have fun anymore if our name is Mark Robinson. And we're not allowed to, there's all kinds of things that we're not allowed to do anymore. And it sucks because we used to be able to run for governor of North Carolina, be a pro-slavery Nazi with a, who brings pizzas to the porn parlors. And we used to be able to get away with that, and we're not anymore, and it sucks. We are allowed to have Lindsay Chervinsky join us, however, to talk about her new book. And I promise you that I'm going to open this interview with a question that she will get from absolutely nobody else. Which is, Lindsay, I wrote a book called Unmaking the Presidency. You've written a book called Making the Presidency. Does that make us book siblings or book enemies?
Oh, I think it has to be siblings, right?
I don't know. I'm undoing your work or vice versa.
Well, I think if it was coming from a place of like, you hate American institutions and we're talking about how to destroy them, then maybe we'd be enemies. But that's not the sense I get, although you could surprise me.
No, I mean, I do regret that the presidency is being unmade. I'm not saying it with any glee or anything. So you think it's book siblings?
I do. Or maybe, yeah, I do. I think it's book siblings.
All right. Next. All right. So point of process here, people, because all of you people in the audience who hate process, you're going to get some now. I interviewed Lindsay the other day for the Lawfare podcast. That interview hasn't run, about all the all the content in her book that is relevant to lawfare. And so we're going to focus today. We reserved all the stuff that's beyond the scope of lawfare for today. And that includes all the gossip and scurrilous rumors and all the personalities, totally inappropriate for lawfare, completely appropriate for dog shirt TV. If you have a question, do not wait for me to call on you for a question, because I'm never going to do it, because there's no way for me to invite you on to ask a question. You just have to take the risk and do that thing where you tell me you want to speak, and I'll bring you on. So don't wait till I say we're going to go to questions now. Just interrupt. All right. I want to start with another question that nobody else is going to ask you. But
Okay.
what was a political party in the late 1790s? Because it's clearly more at this point than when the Federalist paper authors talk about faction. There's clearly sort of organized groups, but it's clearly less than, a modern party in terms of organization and in terms of, they don't run primaries, they don't officially nominate. So at what stage of its evolutionary development is the political party when during the period of the John Adams administration?
So you're right to sort of position it between faction and party. The framers thought that faction would be often a temporary coalition. Like you would form a coalition around one particular issue. And that would be an accurate description for the early Federalists and Anti-Federalists, which were aligned around pro-Constitution or anti-Constitution. So they were either advocating for ratification or they were opposing ratification. By the late 1790s, they were not quite to a place where we would think of as like having a full structure. So for example, the thing that was missing was funding. They didn't have a funding infrastructure. They had newspapers that were a part of their coalition. They had letter networks. They had committees that communicated with one another. They even had get out the vote efforts that included, at the time, Virginia and Pennsylvania and some of the other state laws said that you had to have handwritten ballots with all the names, but the names didn't have to match the signature of the person signing the ballot. So they had
voter
people
fraud.
It's sketchy, but it wasn't actually illegal. So they had people write out thousands and thousands of ballots with all of the electors' names, and then people could just sign them. So there's a get out the vote effort. There's a coalition. There's a press infrastructure, but there's not the financial piece. And so I think that's the thing that kind of comes into play really in the like Andrew Jackson era. That's when that starts to solidify. But they were more sophisticated than often people think that they were.
And there's also seems like the other thing that doesn't exist yet is any kind of formal nominating process.
Well, it's the nomination process that people kind of wanted us to have today.
How do you mean?
So today when Joe Biden had his terrible debate and people were hoping that the powers that be could just make him step aside and appoint someone new, which is not exactly how it worked, but people were clamoring for that. That was very much how it worked back then. The group of leaders in the party, so in the case of the Federalist leaders in Congress met at William Bingham's house in Philadelphia. It was one of the largest mansions at the time, and they picked the candidates. But it was very, backroom cloak and dagger, unlike the more official nomination process we have today.
All right, so let's back up and talk about the subject of your book. The book is about the Adams presidency. It is not a biography of John Adams, and it is about the 4 years of his presidency. Why did you choose that subject?
Well,
especially given that you're the executive director of the Mount Vernon Library.
Yes. To be
Aren't
fair,
you
I
supposed
started
to be
that
writing
job
about Washington.
I started that job 2 months ago. And the book was already in print. So I do think, however, that Adams would find it hilariously subversive that I'm spending my first 6 months talking about him and not George Washington.
I think he would
So
find that delicious.
Yeah, just absolutely delightful.
Because he had a big chip on his shoulder about it.
He did. So I wrote my first book on Washington, and I finished writing about it. And he did establish all of these things about the presidency, but the presidency for him was so personal. Like today, we try to respect and honor and revere the office, not the person. But for Washington, it was the person. And so I wanted to understand how that transitioned. How did the next people make this thing work for them? And that was sort of my initial question. And then January 6th happened, and I realized how much I was taking for granted the peaceful transfer of power and all of our institutions, despite spending many years studying them. And so I started trying to understand, where did that peaceful transfer process start? How were citizens taught to value it? How did it repeat over and over and start to gain traction and power and solidity? And that really begins with Adams. And many of the amazing Adams biographies that have been written do not in any way reflect that, because most of those biographers wrote the books after January or before January 6th, and such that they had not actually seen a contested election.
Yeah. So, and a lot of them, I'm thinking of McCulloch, for example, actually de-emphasize his presidency. It was like, oh yeah, and it's sort of like a lot of the Madison biographers are much more interested in the young Madison than the Madison whose presidency saw the White House get burned to the ground. But I think your insistence that the Adams presidency has real merit, first of all, is clearly right. That his presidency is dominated by a single issue, and he handled it successfully, which was not having a war with France and not avoiding it on humiliating terms. And secondly, that he was caught between the psychotics of his own party and the psychotics of the other party, including Thomas Jefferson, who in office turned out to be much less psychotic than he was as an opposition figure. But he really does seem to me like the only sane person in the country in that period of time. And so I appreciated the like, let's take his presidency seriously as something other than a 4-year interregnum between George Washington and Thomas Jefferson with the Alien and Sedition Acts. Why? So I want to pose a totally unfair question about this, which is, why do we always forget about the quasi-war with France?
So I think that there are, let's say, 3 reasons. Maybe there will be 4 as I go through my list. So the first is that we tend not to remember conflicts where we didn't have soldiers fighting. Something about the Navy does not quite fit in our same estimation. Like, we just don't process it. And I think it's because the Army just feels much more visual to us. Because, for example, there are wars where we have fought that have not been on American soil that we remember, although often with less clarity. Like, for example, World War I is obviously overshadowed by World War II. But we still remember it. And I think that's because the Army is involved. In the quasi-war, there was no Army involvement, sort of by design. There was also no declaration of war, so that is part of it. I think the second piece is maybe a silly one, but like the Treaty of Mortefontaine doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. It's not the Treaty of Versailles or the Treaty of Paris, which, have a lot more emotional impact on our minds. Despite the fact that it was signed with Napoleon, you'd think that would stick. And then the third piece is the news that
it had Talleyrand involved. I mean,
these are big
they had some great characters. our lead negotiator was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. What do you want?
And they celebrate it with like a 24-hour party. So it was like an epic moment in France. But I think the last piece is the news of it did not come back until after most of the votes were cast in the election of 1800. And so it very much validated John Adams' wisdom and knowledge when it came to diplomacy, and confirmed his sort of prescient forethinking about the importance of neutrality. But because it came after the election, it just was not really factored in. And the last piece, I think, is that I've lost count of what I'm at now. This is why I should not make lists from the beginning. But the Arch Federalists were so bitter about this treaty that they initially rejected it. And John Marshall had to go basically person to person and say, do you really want to see what happens when Thomas Jefferson comes into the presidency, and give him the opportunity to do a different treaty? Which they should have, I think, been able to kind of think about those stakes, but apparently not. And so once he made that threat clear, then they did ultimately ratify it. But I think John Adams' own party's less than enthusiastic embrace of this treaty made it something we don't typically remember, and thus the end of a conflict we don't typically remember.
So John Adams, one of the striking things about this book is just how much he and Hamilton hated each other, and how viciously, when you describe reinforcing the norms that created the executive branch, what he's really reinforcing them against is a secret puppeteer in the background named Alexander Hamilton, who's kind of the cabinet members are actually reporting to, and is kind of a secret president. And one of the things that Adams establishes is that the cabinet reports to the president, and he does that through a number of mechanisms, including firing, including, giving direct orders to people, including, defying their direct advice and making clear that it's ultimately the president who's accountable, not them. But one of the things you don't go into, because it really is established by the time the book starts, is that he and Hamilton hate each other, and that he thinks very little of Hamilton, and he doesn't trust him, he doesn't like him, and neither does Abigail. And some of that, the reasons for it trickle out over the course of the book. But, for those who are highly influenced by the musical, why did Adams hate him so much? What was the source of the friction between them?
So I'm also a fan of the musical, so I don't blame anyone for doing so. I think it's exquisite art and has brought a lot of interest to the subject period. So that's great. Adams didn't like Hamilton because he felt that he was extremely hot-headed, could not be trusted, because he always thought he was usually the smartest person in the room, and had a tendency to sort of fly off the handle. I think Adams also had an instinctual distrust of centralized military authority, and Washington sort of avoided that distrust because he had demonstrated that he could be trusted with that type of command. But Hamilton, I think, probably just screamed, his entire being screamed of wanting military glory above all else. Hamilton didn't like Adams because he hadn't served in the military and he had diplomatic service. And so they just spoke a very different language when it came to sacrifice on behalf of the nation. But I should be pretty clear that their dislike when Adams started the presidency was not as open or as hostile as it would become later. Initially, Hamilton just didn't really trust Adams because he understood he couldn't control Adams. He referred to Adams as too independent. He was not enough of a party man. He wouldn't toe the Federalist line. And he was right. Adams did not consider himself to be a party man. And so I think Hamilton had that instinctual understanding that Adams saw himself a part and above of a party process, and so wanted a president in the 1796 election who he could better control. Adams didn't really like Hamilton, but wasn't all that consumed with thought of him until it became clear in 1796 that Hamilton had really campaigned against him and had tried to push the other Federalist candidate past him into the presidency. And at that point, his distrust really became calcified. So I think he was like a slow bubble for a period of time, and then it became quite extreme. And over the course of the presidency, it only became more exaggerated as Adams ignored Hamilton or tried to sideline him or try and keep him at arm's length. And there was nothing Hamilton hated more than being ignored. And Hamilton tried to sort of assert himself over foreign policy, especially. And Adams could not help but notice that Hamilton had never had any diplomatic experience, had never been to Europe, had never done any of these things, and yet was proclaiming that he knew better. And that was not something that Adams particularly appreciated. Adams was not a know-it-all in all things, but on the things that he knew well, he didn't take kindly to being lectured at.
Well, and he did know diplomacy well, having negotiated a treaty with the court of St. James and been in France. I mean, he actually did know what he was dealing with European diplomacy. But the irony, I was really thinking about it in the context of your book. There's this point at which Adams decides to send a peace commission to France, and his cabinet goes bananas. And it is actually Hamilton behind the scenes, unbeknownst to Adams, who says, guys, he's right. Chill out and support the Peace Commission, and actually persuades the Secretary of State, Pickering, don't stab the president in the back on this one. And so I was sort of counting as I went through, they actually did agree on a bunch of stuff, including, of course, that Jefferson should prevail over Aaron Burr, on the most important issues. They actually align more than with important exceptions, like I'm sure Adams didn't appreciate having a pamphlet written about his character, and they didn't align about the standing army thing. But on some of the most important issues, they were actually closer than Adams was to the crazies in his own government.
Yes, I think that's totally so. I think Hamilton's, in a lot of ways, Hamilton's downfall is when he felt like he was losing control. And so initially in Adams' presidency, he wasn't that far displaced from Washington's administration. He still felt like he had a lot of influence. And so he could be very rational. He could be very realistic and level-headed about foreign policy. And initially his recommendations to the rest of the secretaries about sending this peace commission reflected that rationalism. Over the course of Adams' presidency, when the possibility of military glory became obvious, when it was clear that there might be an army and there might be a war, he lost touch with that rationalism, and he failed to see that France was never going to send an army to the United States. It just didn't make sense. And so there was no need for a 50,000 person U.S. army. And yet Hamilton started coming up with these plans that they would send the army through the South to crush domestic opposition or opponents and seize the Floridas and New Orleans, which are insane things to do. And so it's kind of like he lost touch with reality at a certain point. And I think that was because he felt his grasp on this vision for what his career could be slipping.
Although I will point out it was a crazy thing to do, and it was in fact then done by the Madison administration.
That's true.
Not with a 50,000 person standing army, but but by means of early covert action, they kind of did in the spirit of the Republicans eventually becoming the Federalists.
It's a very excellent point. Although at that point there was at least like sort of a war declared, whereas there was the Spain wasn't even yet in the war, and Spain was the one that was actually holding this territory. So it really required like multiple steps to get there. But yes, that's true. Eventually, the United States did decide it was just going to be theirs.
Andy, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so I'm curious which founding father you kind of lost the most respect for in researching this book. You said on the Shield of the Republic podcast that I mean Washington and Jefferson do not come up good. You came close to accusing Jefferson of treason. And I'm curious what like the juiciest piece of historical gossip you have about that is.
Yes.
Thank
So technically the definition, well, first of all, thank you for the question. Technically, the definition of treason requires a declaration of war. Had there been a declaration of war and Jefferson had been actively colluding with the French government, then I think that would have been defined as treason. He was just colluding with the French government that was seizing American ships and sailors, even though there wasn't a said declaration. I mean, I still retain tremendous respect for Washington. I do think that he made mistakes in this period, but I think in a lot of ways, the mistakes he made reflect some of the trickiest issues that we still grapple with today. And so I give a little bit more grace in that space. I will confess that I've never been particularly high on Jefferson. I think he was a brilliant writer and a hugely impactful figure for the 50 years that he was in public life. But I think he was really kind of a jerk face and very duplicitous, especially up until the time he was in the presidency, when he decided that all the things he had criticized in his opponents actually sounded pretty good, including some sedition laws. I never really had a whole lot of respect for Timothy Pickering, and I'm not sure we would put him in the founding father category anyway, but if I did, that certainly would be all gone. But I think Hamilton does take a little bit of a beating in this book, in my estimation.
Another one who takes a beating in this, albeit in a brief kind of drive-by beating, is James Monroe.
Oh, yes.
Which, most Americans know James Monroe, if they know him at all, as because the Monroe Doctrine, and he had a house near Jefferson's, and, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah.
But what you reminded me of is that his origin story is of sort of like a rabid Republican partisan who kind of outflanks Jefferson on the let's guillotine them all caucus.
Yeah. So James Monroe was the last of the, founding generation presidents. He was the last to wear old-fashioned pants. So when he was president, he was still wearing like the old-fashioned breeches. If you look at his writings and his correspondence, man, he's boring as dirt. He just like, I have the great benefit of having spent many years in the correspondence of Adams and Jefferson and Hamilton and Washington, and their intelligence. Write. Yeah, I mean, their intelligence comes out in very different ways. Washington was not the intellect, but he had a really high emotional IQ and knew how to, and I mean, Monroe, just in comparison, it's just like, oh, it's so boring. But he makes up for his boringness with just a lack of common sense. And that common sense, or the lack of it, is often demonstrated by things like when he was initially, one of the big first things he did was he was the minister to France under Washington. He had actually served with Washington at Valley Forge and the Battle of Trenton and Princeton, and apparently had been quite a brave officer. He then went to France and sided with France over the United States and was making all these toasts to Revolutionary era France that were wildly inappropriate. He came back. He wrote this 500-page book about how Washington was terrible, which generally wasn't a great idea. He then almost got into a duel with Alexander Hamilton. He then sort of disappears for a minute, and then he comes back as governor of Virginia, under which one of the biggest slave rebellions in U.S. history took place under his watch. And then towards the end kind of like fades out. But when he comes back later in his career and he's the president of the United States, he almost gets into a duel with his Secretary of War, William Crawford, in the White House. Apparently they were having a cabinet meeting and he and Crawford like almost come to blows in the president's study. So yeah, he probably doesn't, I don't think he usually ranks very high in my estimation.
So how did, I mean, just as a bit of a tangent, but how did a mediocrity of that caliber, one who, you know, kind of blows it as governor, really blows it as minister to France, and that's actually a thing that is depicted at some, that's the drive-by in the book, but has no particular distinction. How did he end up, you know, succeeding James Madison as president?
So he had a very good knack for making and keeping powerful friends. He benefited greatly by many of his failures coming at a time when they could be dismissed due to the partisan atmosphere. So his failure in France, the Democratic Republicans or the Jeffersonian Republicans were able to blame on Washington and the Federalists by basically saying that he was put into an untenable situation and could not have possibly succeeded because they were asking him to do unfair things. And so that part they were able to dismiss as just part of this, you know, partisan system. His governorship, because he would then responded with such extreme intensity of crackdown on this violence and executed a lot of people, including those who probably were innocent. He was able to sort of survive the governorship. But really, the reason he rose to presidential power was because he was one of Jefferson's proteges. And he was very much in the Jefferson wing. He was very much loyal to the Jefferson cause. When Madison became Jefferson's Secretary of War, then Monroe became Madison's Secretary of War, or no, Madison became Jefferson's Secretary of State. He then became Madison's Secretary of War during the War of 1812 and sort of turned things around at the end and kind of was this like long line of Jeffersonian heirs. And so he just had the good common sense to have really good protectors and friends and to stay loyal to them.
So at the end of your book, you give a kind of slightly mournful account of how Jefferson outmaneuvers Adams in writing for history. That is, he leaves a huge number of notes. And you imply that he does this intentionally for posterity. That a lot of our interpretations of things like the Midnight Judges are heavily influenced by Jefferson's letters and not especially true. What do we have wrong? So what are the big myths, the things that we have wrong about the Adams presidency as a result of sort of Jeffersonian, not misinformation or disinformation, but information manipulation?
So I think the first big thing was that Adams was a much more fanatical Federalist than he was. Jefferson really believed that he had been captured by these extreme interests, and I just don't think the evidence bears that out, both in terms of the split with the party, but also the steps he took to actively sideline them towards the end. And so when Jefferson wrote about the Alien and Sedition Acts, he often puts that at Adams' feet, and he does bear some blame because he signed the legislation, but he was never the brainchild behind those things, and most Americans did not blame him for being the brainchild behind those things. They understood that was...
And what would you say was, I mean, you say he signed them, but what would you say was Adams's role in the Alien and Sedition Acts? Obviously, it happened under his watch. He signed them, but so why should we be forgiving of him with respect to that? I do want to add that the the case for the Alien Acts were always better than the case for the Sedition Acts. But
yeah, so the Alien and Sedition Acts are actually technically there were four bills that have been lumped under this umbrella. The first was a naturalization bill that made it harder for immigrants to become citizens, largely because immigrants tended to vote for the Jeffersonian Republicans. The second, there were two alien bills. One was a very common sense war measure that was actually bipartisan in its passage that allowed the president to initiate deportation proceedings against foreign nationals of a nation who the United States had declared war against with all appropriate due process. We have had a bill like that on the books since then, and it has been used in wartime. It is appropriate because it does require the declaration of war and because it does provide for due process protections. The other one was insane and allowed the president to basically deport whoever they wanted at will. But critically, Adams never used that power.
Right.
He was very meticulous in not using it. And then the last one is the Sedition bill, which I do think there were good faith fears about the use of speech to provoke and inflict violence, which did occur at some distinct length. And there were not the same sort of jurisprudence limitations on the First Amendment that we recognize today. Today, you don't have an unlimited right to free speech that is designed to invoke violence. That had not been adjudicated yet. And so I do think there was a good based fear, but it was then used to create this very political piece of legislation. The reason I think that Adams doesn't deserve quite as much blame is because the president did not really have a role in crafting legislation and coming up with legislation. Under the Adams administration, the president was not involved in the legislative agenda really in any way. And so Congress created these bills and then dropped him on his door. And so he, again, does deserve blame for signing them, but they were not his doing in their initial passage. And I think he deserves credit for showing restraint when it comes to the really insane Alien Act. The Sedition Act, the prosecutions were largely overseen by Timothy Pickering, and Adams did occasionally enjoy them because some of the people were particularly intense against him. But I do think that nuance is important.
And what about Abigail Adams? She seemed like more of an enthusiast for the Sedition Acts.
She was. She both was a little bit more of an enthusiast because she really didn't like the bile that was being spewed in the newspapers. I also think to a certain extent, so on one hand, she was more extreme. On the other, she wrote in some of her letters to her sister that she really feared for John's life because death threats were being delivered to the president's house. And there was no Secret Service at the time. There was no gate. So people could just walk right up to the door. And while I'm not forgiving in any way the legislation, I do think it's a little bit understandable from a human condition that sometimes we are more protective of those we love than we are of ourselves.
So it is a commonplace at this point that they had a genuinely unusual marriage in that period, that she is a figure of immense importance in his administration, including in public ways, and that she kind of functioned sort of like a modern chief of staff, at least when she was in town, which seems like roughly about half the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious what the perception of her role was among the political class in Philadelphia. Was it just a sort of understanding that she was a force to be reckoned with, and if you wanted to deal with the Adams presidency, that was part of it? Or was there disapproval of it? Was there admiration? The reaction to her is a little bit opaque to me.
Well, it was very mixed. So you are right that it was in the open, that people very much understood her importance. Critics of Adams called her his cabinet of one, which was a very accurate, sometimes, description. when people felt like she could be useful to them or she was aligned with their interests, they were very positive about her influence. And in fact, when Adams sent his second peace commission in 1799, or nominated them anyway, a lot of the Federalists said that they wish that the old woman had been in town, because if she had been in town, she would have stopped it. And both Adams and Abigail heard about this and they thought it was very funny, and they wrote back and forth, and she called it very saucy. That was her favorite phrase. And she said it's very saucy, but actually she thought that diplomacy was a great stroke. And so she was very much on board. I think that actually shows a great deal of bigness from, I think, John's spirit, that he knew that people thought that she could control him and he was amused by it as opposed to threatened by it. At other times, when they felt like she was opposed to him or opposed to their interests, they refer to her as more political than the French ladies, which was an allusion to the French women at court prior to the Revolution that had these salons and had been very influential, and especially according to people like Jefferson, were not appropriately feminine because they were involved in politics in a way that was too masculine. And it is also an allusion to French prostitutes, to French courtesans. So it was very much an insult designed to attack her intellectualism. So it just really depended on the moment. People were okay with her when she was useful, and then thought that she was too involved when she was not.
But one thing there isn't about her, if she had been Roman instead of American, then every death in her vicinity would be blamed on her, right? She would have poisoned people, and there's both the Romans, if she had been a Julio Claudian, there would be conspiracy theories about her, and she does seem to have largely escaped that and been sort of oddly a figure of some admiration, which I can't think of another woman in that period who is just regarded as a fact of life politically. It actually seems like a real tribute to her and how much she must have mattered, that people didn't, there's no, when Adams does something that people don't like, they don't attribute it to her, like the secret hand of Abigail. In fact, they wish that she had been there because she might have stopped it. That seems like a kind of inversion of the sort of Lady Macbeth way that a lot of the time we talk about powerful women, particularly, I'm thinking particularly of Rome, but
yeah. No, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think so. I think part of it was probably that, she had done all of the things that there was this concept at the time called Republican motherhood, where the best way for women to be involved were to be well-educated, not like, university educated, but well-educated mothers, such that they could raise good and virtuous citizens who were committed to the future of the nation and would make patriotic citizens. And she very much fit that mold. She was educated at home. She did not go to university. She did not work outside the house. She raised a family. There was clearly a family committed to service. She stayed at home when John went abroad. She stayed at home when he went to government. She took care of the house and was frugal and very aware of presenting a modest picture. And so I think, not unlike sometimes we do today, that like women are more acceptable in the political realm once they have checked certain boxes. And she checked those boxes. And then she also, despite all of her intellect, presented a very modest image. She was not trying to be showy in her politics or in her political knowledge, but was just sort of steadfast in it in a way that I think was probably not as challenging as a, Lady Macbeth type version later.
So tell us about you. What is your, what is your professional history? How did you come to be betraying the Mount Vernon institution by writing about John Adams. Like, what's the Lindsay Chervinsky story?
Yeah. So I've always been a history nerd. I've always loved history. I was going to be a lawyer. I did mock trial competitively for like 8 years growing up. And so maybe not just a history nerd. Maybe we can just drop that and say nerd more broadly. I took the LSATs. I applied to law schools. I got in, and then at the last moment decided I did not want to do that.
Good choice.
Very good choice. Given that my husband is a lawyer, my brother's a lawyer, and my father's a lawyer, having seen it, I'd rather stick needles in my eyeballs. I then decided it'd be great to go to school for longer, and got my master's and PhD, and then did a postdoc. And so finally finished school after a very long time. And there were no, for those of you who are familiar with the professional historic field, there were no jobs on people who studied dead white guys in the early republic. No. And so I went into the public history realm, and I worked for some public history organizations for several years, which I actually think turned out to be a silver lining, because I actually think if I was a professor and just a professor, I would be a little bit bored.
What is the public history realm?
So like nonprofits, like historical organizations, historic houses, education organizations. There are a lot of different ways that you can do it. But I was at the White House Historical Association, which is in DC, for a couple of years, which shares the history of the White House and the people that lived and worked in it. And that was really useful. I learned a lot about how to do public history and how I wanted to do public history. The thing about the White House Historical Association is because of its sort of unique donor base, they didn't really want to talk about the presidency, because they basically change donors whoever's depending in office. And so I eventually decided that I had gone to school for way too long to not write about what I wanted to write about. And the White House wasn't enough, and I wanted to actually talk about the presidency. And so I left, and I started doing my own thing, and I wrote a lot, and I spoke a lot, and I taught, and I did all kinds of media, and was sort of putting together my own career and really loving it and not planning to do anything else ever. And then this job became vacant, and the head of Mount Vernon, the CEO, said, "I want you to do it." And I said, "Okay, here are my concerns." And one of them was, I'm not publishing a book on Washington. I've already done that. I'm not writing another one. And he said, as long as it's about the presidency, then we're good, because it's not an official presidential library through the NARA system, but it is a presidential library. And so I said, okay. And I said, can I continue to do all the things that I want to do? And he said, yes. And I said, okay. And I said, can I bring my dog to the office? And he said, yes. And I said, okay, done. So I'm here. And the really lovely 180 circle of this was that I was a fellow at the library in 2015 when I was working on my book on the cabinet on George Washington's administration. So it's a very full circle moment. And the library is only about 11 years old. So it has a really amazing foundation, but I have the opportunity in the second decade to continue to grow it. And that is a really cool place to be.
And so what is the library? Is it a library of, normally when we think of a presidential library, it's the president's papers. And in more recent years, it's the president's papers under the Presidential Records Act. So it's actually administered by the National Archive. But Washington's papers are wherever they are. There some of them are in the National Archive, some of them are you guys have some of them. So what is the function of the library at Mount Vernon?
So Mount Vernon and the library itself has always been privately run. They don't take any federal or state funding. And so that means the library is the same. As you said, the Washington papers are wherever. The largest portion of them is at the Library of Congress, and they are not giving them back. I have asked. And so we do a couple of things. One, there is an editorial papers project that has been putting together the volumes of the Washington papers for many decades now. some of which are behind me. And they will wrap up that process in 2028. And then the scans of all of those papers that they have collected from archives around the world will come here. So we will actually have the most complete collection, although not of originals. We also have a ton of other manuscript items from the history of the estate and its descendants, and we have gone about trying to acquire a lot of Washington letters. But for example, we have all of Bushrod Washington's papers, and he was a Supreme Court justice and one of Washington's heirs. We also have the records. Yes. We also have the records of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, which has run the place since the 1850s and has an incredibly complex record of historic preservation, but also the descendant community, the enslaved descendant community that lived in the area. And then we have gone about trying to reacquire the books that he owned. So putting together back Washington's original library, because he was actually a very enthusiastic collector. So that's sort of the library piece. We have a very robust fellowship program to encourage study and scholarship on Washington's lifetime broadly conceived and the presidency. We're really building out that piece of the fellowship program. We have a public program system that has everything from symposiums to nighttime events to lunchtime talks. Those are all open to the public, which is a great way to bring this work to a broader community. And then we have a leadership institute, which does programming based on historic leadership for organizations and government groups and all sorts of others. So it is a very big tent. My goal is to make this place a gathering spot for the DC community to have really big, difficult conversations about the most pressing issues and what we can learn from history to help inform them. That was how Washington approached his leadership. And I think it is more important now than ever to take advantage of all the things that the DC community has to offer and the different types of people that come here. And if we can be a spot to host those conversations and that work, then that is my goal.
And just for those who are not in the area and don't understand the geography, where is Mount Vernon relative to the DC community?
So if you are in Washington, D.C. and you're looking at a map, the original Washington, D.C. would have included, it's basically a triangle, and it would have included Alexandria in the bottom corner before that was eventually ceded back to Virginia. If you go about 9 miles south of Alexandria, that is where Mount Vernon is, on the banks of the Potomac. You can actually they have lots of ferries that go back and forth from Georgetown to Mount Vernon, which is a cool little day trip. It's also there's a beautiful bike path that goes all the way, and it's a lovely drive. So it is an easy jaunt just across the river into the Old Dominion, but even Yankees are welcome.
And so what's your next big project? Are you going to move forward into the Jeffersonian period, or are you going to, you've already said you're not retreating back and writing another book on Washington. So who's next?
I am not retreating into Washington, but I also refuse to write a book on Jefferson because this book actually was supposed to originally be Adams and Jefferson. And I started writing it and I cut off the Jefferson point because I just couldn't do it. Everyone has their own motivation for writing books. And I just cannot, if I'm going to spend years in someone's head, I have to find something about them to hook me. And Jefferson just doesn't do it for me. So there will be no Jefferson book. I'm toying around with a couple of different ideas. There's one that is big and ambitious, but will be hard to write. And one that is a little bit smaller, but I think would be fun to write and is probably more sensible given that I just started this job and I am readjusting to what that will look like. But I have to see what I end up doing. What president do you think I should write about?
Well, are you committed to the founding era?
No.
I mean, I think the Madison presidency is more interesting than the Jefferson presidency.
Okay.
Both for a bunch of reasons. I think the Quincy Adams presidency is under discussed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think after that, other than Jackson, who's fascinating in a kind of macabre sort of way, they're all boring until the Civil War. I don't I don't know. My current biographical obsession is not a president, but a scientist. And so I don't know. Who are you currently obsessed with?
Well, okay, so I'll share the two projects that are sort of in deliberation. So the big one that I think could really make a long-term difference, that I think is really fascinating, but would be extremely difficult to write for two reasons, is I would like to write about the presidencies together of Grant and Eisenhower. No one has ever written about them together, and the similarities are breathtaking,
Right.
and have implications that are really interesting. It's difficult for two reasons. One, those are two huge bodies of literature that I need to make sure I'm comfortable with. And the source-based material is enormous, because by the time you get to Eisenhower, not only do you have like typewriters, but you also have film and audio, which is really cool to be able to hear what they sounded like. That is not something I have experienced thus far, but is a different challenge. The second problem is that book cannot be written chronologically. And books are easier to write when they're written chronologically, because the brain works that way. And so trying to figure out how to weave it together would be really hard. That is probably not the smart book to write, given that I'm 2 months into a new job. That is hard. So it probably makes more sense to do the other book first and then work on that one. And in the meantime, be able to talk about that subject, because there are a lot of really interesting parallels between Washington and Grant and Eisenhower. And they were very cognizant of Washington's example. So like start to develop those ideas through talks, which is where I tend to actually work out most of my material as a starting point anyway. And instead start with this other book, which is that, are you familiar with Eric Larson's Fort Sumter book?
No.
He's written a bunch of books where he takes a moment like Fort Sumter or the sinking of Lusitania or something that people know about, but they're not really familiar with. And he writes in-depth narrative treatments of like an 8-month period of time. And I would love to do that for the Monroe Doctrine, because I think that it's actually super interesting. It's the start of like the Declaration of American Empire. It's a fantastic cast of characters. John Quincy Adams does not get enough credit for it. And, as I mentioned earlier, Monroe and Crawford are like fighting duels in the White House. And John Quincy Adams is basically formulating this world plan, and then somehow gets Great Britain to agree to it, despite the fact that it has the largest navy in the world. So I think that could be a really interesting, really fun book to write, because I could do a lot of world building and write it chronologically and tell a really good story. It just is not I don't have the hook yet to explain why I think it's super relevant, other than an instinctual understanding about this is the moment that the U.S. is declaring what it's going to be, even if it's not there yet. I have the
hook for you.
Okay, what is it?
The hook is when we were China. This is exactly what China is doing in the South China Sea right now. And we're Britain, and we're opposing it. And we're engaged in freedom of navigation operations to prevent it, and they're saying, what are you talking about? You did the Monroe Doctrine, and the Monroe Doctrine was exactly that. It was stay out of our freaking territorial seas.
No one has said that to me yet. That's really good.
Would you
like to come around with me to all of my agent meetings and just like pitch it to the editors for me?
Check out a book by, he was actually on Dog Shirt TV, a guy named Sean Mirsky,
Okay.
Mirski, about it has kind of overtones of this story. But it's a book about U.S. interventionism in Latin America in mostly in the early part of the 20th century. But the serial need to intervene to keep foreign powers out.
Mm-hmm.
And it has real overtones of this story, but I think the catch is now we're on the other side. We're the big remote empire, and we don't like what we did anymore. 'But once upon a time, we were China, and we were trying to, get the imperial powers out of our way so that we could have regional hegemony.
That's really good. Thank you.
Yeah, we're going to leave it there. Lindsay Chervinsky, you're a great American. It's a fabulous book, people. And I would say that even if we were not book siblings, because it actually is.
Thank you.
If you have any interest in founding era history, the establishment of the presidency before I came along and unmade it, or just these incredible personalities that we are blessed and cursed with having had create our country. I cannot recommend it highly enough. Come back and join us again, and we will. You are welcome anytime to talk founding era history or anything else that is on your mind, Lindsay. It's great to see you.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you all. I really appreciate it. And I will definitely be back.
We will be back next week. Not sure yet what the schedule is going to be. Look out for the email sometime over the weekend whenever I put the schedule together. As Lindsay can tell you, it's usually a matter of texting with somebody or chatting with somebody and say, hey, do you want to do Dog Shirt TV next week? And usually they say yes. Can't have fun anymore, but we can have cool new books about subjects you think you already knew about. See you later, guys.